Welcome to a lecture on the marketing environment. Over the course of the next several minutes, we're going to be exploring this concept called the marketing environment and really its relevance in a business setting. We'll start by discussing really what it is, and then we'll get into some of the efficacy surrounding it. So for starters, let's explore really what the marketing environment is. And if you've watched any of my prior lecture videos, you notice we've talked about this concept called the external business environment. That, although not required to kind of understand this, is helpful because it's very similar with regards to its purpose. So when we speak generally, and again, talking about the marketing environment, we're referring specifically in the context of marketing, but obviously this has a lot of benefit even outside of the marketing discipline. But really what we're talking about is all of the, let's say, direct and indirect forces that may influence a business's marketing strategies. Now, this is, of course, a pretty wide net, let's say, influence a business's marketing strategies. So very similar to the external business environment, we're talking about things that are outside of the control of the business. And so the best that we can do is identify what these are and then, of course, try to adjust our strategy. Since all businesses operate in an environment, we need to be aware of what those factors are so that we can kind of make changes. And so if you were to look at the business kind of strategies here, so we'll quickly map out the 4 Ps. So if you're familiar with marketing to an extent, you'll know that generally speaking, when we talk about marketing strategy, there's usually 4 things that businesses do, right? So we have a product strategy, which includes the features of a product and ultimately the solution to the pain that the consumer, we believe, has. We also have a pricing strategy of some kind, which is, again, dependent upon the consumer, and we use a number of different sort of pricing tactics, if you will, to try to sell to our consumer. Of course, we have distribution, which we often refer to as place, so getting our product to the place that it can be consumed by our target consumer. And then also we have promotion, and promotion deals with informing and educating and persuading consumers to whether it's make an immediate purchase or maybe just influence their decisions later on down the road. So this is what we call the marketing mix or marketing strategy. So businesses have a lot of control over what happens in this circle. We can control what to produce. We can control what channels to distribute it in. We obviously set pricing and all those things, but those decisions are actually influenced by other things, by other pieces of information. And that's where we get to kind of this marketing environment concept here, because what is happening in the marketing environment is going to influence our decisions related to our marketing strategies. So at this point, you're probably wondering, well, what are some of the factors or forces, if you will, in the marketing environment that we have to be somewhat aware of so that we can, of course, try to adapt as best we can. So there are actually 4 separate forces, really 5 sort of, but 2 are kind of combined into one. So we have what we call political and legal, often just abbreviated as political legal, sometimes referred to in some textbooks as political, legal, and regulatory, basically the same thing. We also have social forces. We have competitive and economic. And again, in some textbooks, they tease out and separate competitive from economic. I mean, really, it doesn't matter all that much as long as we're considering both of them. And the last thing that we have to look at are the technological forces. So all of these things kind of collectively kind of work in tandem, if you will, and of course, exert influence over what's happening as far as our strategies go. And businesses that are successful and do a really good job in catering to consumers and obviously being relevant based upon what's going on in the current environment are really good at not only doing research and understanding what's happening, but also adapting to it. And again, the business can't influence what's happening in its marketing environment. It's impossible to do. The best that we can do, though, is if we're aware of it, we can make changes to lessen the impact of it, and we can adapt these guys here, right, our marketing strategies, to counteract it or to take advantage of maybe some opportunities that have been created because of whatever disruption is happening in the environment. So just briefly, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some things that you might see in political legal, or at least in the forces, if you will. But honestly, based upon the names, you can kind of infer what are some of the things that would be considered at any particular point. So starting with political legal and kind of working in a clockwise fashion, when we talk about political, legal, and regulatory forces, really what we're referring to is any type of government influence. So that could be anything from changing laws, that can be changing regulations, that can be court decisions, that can be changes with regards to intellectual property. I mean, really anything related to kind of a government influence and how that could impact our marketing strategies. So a great example of this is, I'm sure you might have seen recently, and this was in the last couple months, that Juul, which is the popular maker of kind of e-cigarettes, has been I think forced to lay off quite a few people within its organization. And that's been a direct result because of changes in political legal environment where a lot of different governments are placing bans on that particular product. And so looking at it from the company standpoint, because of those changes, well, now I have to adapt potentially my distribution, right? Because I can't distribute ordinarily like I did because now there are certain restrictions that are imposed. That's really what you want to kind of think about there. Even in today's relevant time, you could argue that a lot of the shelter-in-place orders associated with the kind of containment of COVID are in many ways a political legal force that affects a business's marketing strategies. And there are plenty of examples of things that businesses are doing to try to adapt, right? So you talk about place, so looking at distribution, and you probably can think of a few things that businesses are doing with regards to that marketing strategy as a direct result of political legal, whether it's doing curbside pickup or whether it's restaurants, and now you're utilizing kind of existing parking lots and putting up tents and trying to serve people outdoors and doing all these things. So that's one example of not only a political legal force, but also how a business is adapting to that. And again, you can kind of see the benefit of paying attention to these things and trying to adapt accordingly. Now, when you get over here to the competitive and economic environment, really what we're looking at primarily is going to be not only competition, right? So ultimately competitor actions and what are those other businesses that cater to similar customers, what are they doing, and does that force me or maybe compel me to change my marketing strategy in some way, but also the economy and the condition of the economy where the business is operating in can be one force that we have to consider. So I'll give you an example in the competitor action section. Just recently, I can't remember which airline was the first to move, but since then, all of them, at least all of the major airlines, have followed suit in eliminating the change fees. So if you book a flight and then have to change your flight because your plans are altered in some way, whether it's a family emergency or otherwise, you normally would have to pay a fee for that. And as ridiculous as that sounds, because it's pretty much automated the change process anyway, it was a fee that was imposed, and obviously that would count as revenue for the airlines, and people didn't like it, right? If you had to ever change plans and pay for those fees, it was very frustrating to do. Well, one airline decided we're not going to do that because frankly the airline industry has been significantly impacted by COVID just because of the lack of demand. And then all the other airliners followed suit, and so they adjusted sort of their product strategy based upon what another competitor is doing. Now, that isn't to say that when one competitor does something, you should follow suit. Obviously, you got to assess that on a case-by-case basis on its individual merits, but it is something that you need to consider. We need to be aware of what our competition is doing so that we can make a decision if ultimately our marketing strategies should shift as well. As far as the condition of the economy, this should kind of go without saying. So when you're looking at the health of consumers, there are a number of different economic indicators that we can look at, right? You can look at things like GDP, you can look at the unemployment rate, whether it's the U3 or the U6 rate that we've talked about in prior lectures, all of those things to get a gauge on the economy. And if the economy isn't performing well, maybe that means we need to introduce products at a lower price point. Maybe that means if it's a great economy, we can introduce products at a higher price point. We change our distribution strategies. Ultimately, a lot of things can change as a result of what's happening in the competitive and economic force area. All right, moving on to the next one, we have the technological forces here. And the way that I like to describe technological forces is really technology or using technology, and I'm going to abbreviate that as just tech, to add value to consumers. And so if there is a new technology that is available, it could be a benefit for the company to incorporate that into its existing product in some way and use that in a way that's going to benefit consumers. So whether that is artificial intelligence or augmented reality, or anything else for that matter, obviously that can be used in a way and might affect how a company chooses to promote and other things. And likewise, if new technology is created, that might render a business's existing services as, let's say, obsolete. Well, then the business needs to, of course, figure out a way to adapt to that, which can become increasingly, challenging. And a big shift that we've seen over the last 20 years has been that in e-commerce. It has continued to increase as far as the rate of purchases that are done, via a computer. And then since then, within the last 10 years, the proportion of purchases that have happened versus on mobile devices versus like a desktop computer have also begun to shift, with many purchases now, over 50%, being done on mobile devices, which of course is a lot to do with kind of the ubiquity of the smartphone that was popularized by Apple many years ago. And that, of course, is creating challenges for businesses today. And we've seen that as a result of COVID, those businesses that had a strong, I want to say good and then great, and so I combine them into GRUD, which is an actual word. So those businesses that had a great e-commerce presence were uniquely positioned to kind of transition compared to those businesses that were entirely brick and mortar, and then were trying to figure out how do we adapt in this online world. And fortunately, many businesses made those adjustments quickly, but I can imagine that was a pretty stressful transition given all the things that were happening at the time. Now, the last area that we're going to talk through for this lecture is the social forces area, and that's where we're talking about the public opinions and attitudes. And really what we're focusing on here is just kind of the mindset of society as a whole. And this is, of course, something that businesses need to kind of not only be aware of just for sake of being relevant, but also potentially adapt to. And so one thing that's very topical now that you're seeing influence a lot of marketing strategies for businesses is the recent kind of sort of race relations, and how we've seen within the last 3 to 4 months that has become very prominent in the news, especially here in the US particularly. And you're seeing a lot of businesses now, obviously, whether it's choosing to donate a portion of their profits to certain charitable organizations that serve minority groups, or taking, you've seen the NFL and the NBA obviously take more of a stronger stance, sort of, in terms of allowing players to demonstrate before games and running marketing campaigns, and regardless of your opinion on whether or not that is legitimate or if it is something that is just a PR campaign, you can't discount the influence that public opinion has had, and ultimately businesses wanting to adapt to that. Again, does it mean that a business should continue to change constantly based upon public opinion? Maybe not. That's an individual decision, but it does echo the importance of kind of catering to your customer. And if that's your customer, then maybe it's something that should be considered. So as we kind of take a step back and look at the marketing environment, there's a couple of things that I want to impress upon you before we end. The first thing is that these are forces that businesses cannot control. That's a very important concept to understand. And that's really not why we study it to begin with, is to try to influence it. It's to adapt. And that really is the aim of this. So it really highlights, secondly, that it's important for businesses to be constantly scanning the environment. There's this concept in business called environmental scanning. Essentially, it just means you got to pay attention, whether that's reading, paying attention to what's going on in the news, reading the Wall Street Journal on a regular basis, going to industry-specific kind of networking events to get kind of the inside track on what's happening maybe in your local market. Those kinds of things are very important because not all the things are going to be maybe valuable, but there are going to be some opportunities there that may affect your particular business, and you may want to adapt your marketing strategies too, based on whatever that information is. So hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll try to get back to you. I'm not super great at that, but I will do my best. But thanks for watching.